Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. It's the third in a series that's going to be looking at landscape sketching. Today's going to be a reasonably simple one. We're going to be looking at adding tone to your sketches. So the previous 2 weeks we looked at cropping, like measuring, cropping, composing, and then lightly sort of sketching in the position of different aspects of your landscape. So you can probably just about make up, I've got one drawn up to this point. It's from last week. It's the square composition that we picked from this reference. I'll just slide that over slightly. Okay. So it was the, let me put it on this side. It was the square composition from this kind of larger landscape that we chose. We did a few different ones. So I'm going to be working from that today. And we're going to be looking at kind of adding tone to the drawing and developing or establishing a range of values that is appropriate for the subject matter. So in this case, if we look at our reference, you can work from, obviously this is imagining that working from life, but you could work from a color photo, you could work from a black and white photo. In this case, this was the one I had. So if we look at our range of values, you can see that the sky in this region where the cloud is just pure white. Then there's a reflection in the water that's also pure white. Relative to that, so this being the lightest part of the drawing, this would be the darkest part of the drawing, these little shadows in this nearer little clump of trees. So that's where we'll find our kind of darkest dark, and then everything else will be a kind of progression in between that. But we're going to look for the darkest dark, we're not going to look for lots of detail, we're just going to block in large areas of tone that will roughly, approximately match their relationship in the reference. So as I say, we're looking at this. I've kind of got my kind of mountain range roughly sketched in. We know that this section here is going to remain entirely light, so I recommend just starting shading in those sections of the drawing that you know will be at least some sort of value. We're going to be able to erase back into the drawing as well later on, but for now we're just going to be looking for big masses, not looking for lots of details. So I'm going to keep the tree line as a kind of just a jagged edge in terms of values. So I might add a little bit more detail into that tree line. Just because doing so may save a little bit of time later on when we start to add, or next week when we add some details to this drawing. Just looking for these little jagged shapes that make up these these trees. And then moving down into this foreground clump. Then it's even finer down here, so I'm just going to kind of look at the edge of the shoreline. Something like that's probably fine in terms of level of detail. Then go back to this side. So I'm trying to hold the pencil quite far back, being pretty loose with stuff. Trying to keep things fairly organic. Not being too repetitive with my shapes. So something like that's pretty good. And then can maybe block in this lower section of these little rocks that we've got. Put it on that side actually, be a bit clearer. So these little rocks we might want to keep separate at some point, so just make a note of the bottom of this section of trees. Something of a little shape in between them. So we know that this is going to be reasonably dark, so just using the edge of my pencil here, so it's been sharpened to a reasonable point. I'm just using it at a fairly steep angle. To start blocking in those trees. Can do the same thing for this kind of distant section of shoreline. Now all this is going to get a lot darker, but we're just starting to roughly block in these shapes. Can do the same for this foreground. It's going to be a lot darker than the sky. If you remember back to the first lesson we were talking about the different planes or theory of angles from Carlson, where we looked at the fact that the sky is the source of light, so it's always going to be brighter than the ground. Even though these little bits of rock look quite bright, they're not going to be as bright as the sky. We really want the sky to glow, so for that reason we're not going to add too much value into anything kind of further than this area here, because that's where the light source is. So now that that's in place, we can start to really lightly shade in these mountains in the background. As I say, avoid the temptation to do too much in this luminous area here for now. We're just going to be blocking in these nearer, darker parts of the landscape. There's lots of different ways that you can hatch in. I tend to like just using kind of a general similar direction of stroke, so I'm going to start progressively building up these values. So you can see I'm taking my time to build them up. It's better to kind of gradually approach the values that you're after rather than go too heavy at it. If you do kind of go too dark to begin with, it can be harder to erase, so it's nicer to kind of gradually add value to your drawing. So there's this little section in here. I'm just going to shade in as darkly as I possibly can. So this is going to be my darkest dark in the drawing. Basically just pushing the graphite as far as it can go. I'm not going to get too detailed with it, I just want to establish it as a value within the drawing. So using this 2B, that's about as dark as I'm going to get. I'm not going to push it any darker than that. I'm just going to work within the limits of this particular pencil. I just want to pull some of the values in the rest of this clump of tree a bit darker. And this little joining section as well. Now doing this basically just allows me a bit more space for values in the rest of the drawing. This little tree line as well needs to start going a bit darker so that it starts to separate out from the landscape. Not quite as dark as the trees in the near foreground, but pretty close to that level of value. So I'm not going to add any detail, I'm just leaving these as masses for the time being. There's quite a lot more detail that will go into this aspect of the foreground, but we're going to leave it out just for now. Just looking for these main lost my lead there. I might just slightly darken this foreground as well. My reference there. It's quite varied, the foreground, so I just want to we're just looking for average tones for different sections. Overall, if I blow my eyes, it feels slightly darker than the background tones. So that pretty much blocks in our foreground masses. So we've got our trees, ground plane, and those background trees, which are ever so slightly lighter than this mass of trees in the foreground. So what we're left with then is our background masses. So we're going to start trying to block in these background hills and the water as well. So they kind of just work progressively, kind of layers of the hills moving backwards. Which means that the nearer hills are lighter than the others. There's this kind of atmosphere going backwards into the background. So we want to separate them and just kind of capture that as much as possible. So at the moment I'm just looking at which hillsides match which group of values. So roughly this section of this hillside reaching out to here. Possibly slightly dark I've gone there. If I make it too dark, it'll feel as though this section of the drawing is in a similar sort of level to these foreground elements. So the dark portion of the background shouldn't be as dark as these foreground aspects. So that's that hillside roughly blocked in. Then there's this kind of behind this, there's a gradient where it's darker there and kind of getting progressively lighter towards here. There's this other hillside that's ever so slightly lighter behind. So these tones are a bit more subtle. These subtle shifts suggest quite a lot about the relationship between these hillsides. So it's not too bad for those background hills. Maybe just slightly darken this section here. But I don't want to overdo it in the background there. As I say, I really want to try to keep keep this kind of luminosity, this kind of glow as much as possible. So it can maybe push this hillside a bit more. It's not too bad. Which means that the kind of important remaining mass that I need to look for is the reflection of the hillside in this area of water. So blurring my eyes, it's kind of ever so slightly lighter than the hill, and it kind of gradually tapers out as it moves further to this side towards the light. So you're getting this kind of reflection shining down onto the water. So now I want to give just a bit more sense of that glow, so I'm going to add a kind of fall of light. That means that generally I'm just going to darken everything on this side of the drawing, this left hand side. Just kind of adds to that atmosphere, a kind of general overall tonal scheme. And I can go back in and darken some of these sections a bit more. So you can see there we've got a pretty decently established kind of statement of the tonal masses in this sketch, which is a good foundation to work from. I mean, you can even stop here. If you were just doing a tonal study for a painting, this would be a really good point to stop at. It's a good way to explore the different shapes, the kind of the composition as well, without it taking too long. You know, you can do something like this in 20-30 minutes, which is ideal. The main thing is just trying to keep things simple, so you're thinking more about what tones you can put into the drawing rather than the specific shapes or the line work. So most of what I did, I had those kind of light outline sketch, but a lot of what I was doing was just shading, so kind of progressively adding more and more tone to the drawing, and that was how it filled in really effectively. So what I'd look for you guys to do is, with either going out into the landscape or using a sketch that you worked with in the last, or a photo you worked with in the last lesson, where you were kind of blocking things out or cropping them, use that as a basis for this kind of little tonal study. So bigger than a thumbnail, maybe like sort of 5-6 inches square, or 4.5 inches square. This probably is something like that. Just mess around with these sorts of tonal mass studies. And then next week we'll be doing, either with this drawing or another one, looking at beyond this point, how you can develop it into something a bit more fleshed out with a bit more detail. But you won't actually be moving too much. These values will remain roughly the same. If you were to carry on further in the drawing, you would just be adding more detail, but not altering the general value statement of this first sketch. So yeah, hopefully that was interesting for you guys. That's it for this week. As always, you can look at the extra lesson document on OCAD if you're a subscriber, or you can look on the blog. If you have any questions, just post them below, or if you're a subscriber, get in touch. If you've got any work you want to show me, I'm always interested to see. But yeah, hopefully that was good, and I'll see you guys soon.